Alright guys, for this lesson, you're going to need your plates, so I would definitely have those out. I tried to take a picture so I can demonstrate as we go through, so you'll see pictures in the corner that I'll zoom in on. But the goal today is we're doing inverse trig functions. So pretty much what you're doing today is you're using your plate in reverse. They're going to actually tell you the angle, and they're going to ask you to either use sine -1, cosine -1, or tangent -1, which means you need to think in reverse. We're going to undo it. So you're looking for where the answer, what angle has that answer is what we're looking for. We're kind of looking backwards. So the first thing I just need to talk through this top is there's restrictions on where we can look on the plate for each of the different trig functions based on the fact that we have to keep this in inverse. If we were to look at the sine graph, it goes on forever and ever and ever, and if we did the horizontal line test, it wouldn't be able to pass that. So we have to put restrictions on where we can look on the plate in order to keep it a function. So for sine -1, we have to keep our answers have to be between -pi/2 and pi/2. And our plate doesn't have any negative answers, so we kind of have to think a little bit about how we're going to answer these. So for sine, and this also is going to apply to tangent as well, so I'll highlight that one too. The place you're going to look on your plate is you're just going to look in the first quadrant. If they give you a positive angle, you're going to look in quadrant 1, and you're going to give a positive answer. For negative angles, you're going to look in quadrant 1 again, but you're going to give a negative answer. The answer on the plate will be positive. You're going to give a negative answer as your angle. So same thing's going to happen for tangent. The same rules apply for tangent. We're looking from -pi/2 to pi/2. This is how we're getting those negative answers, is we're just going to take the positive one from quadrant 1 and we're going to make it negative, and that's where it would have that negative value. Cosine's a little different. If you look at cosine, the interval for cosine is different because it behaves a little bit differently here. It can have an answer between 0 and pi. So that means we can look in either the first or the second quadrant. We don't have to think about any negative answers. They're already going to be on the plate. There are no negative angles, so we won't get any negative answers here. So we should be looking, if it's a positive answer, we would look in quadrant 1 because cosine's positive in quadrant 1. And if it's a negative, it would have a negative angle in quadrant 2. So you'll look in quadrant 2 and you'll just give the answer right off the plate. You don't have to think outside the plate for cosine. So let's take a look at the first example. Remember when we're looking at the plate that the functions are in order of cosine, sine, and then tangent. So just remember that when you're looking here. So for the first one, we want to know where sine is positive radical 2/2. So sine, we're going to look at the first quadrant no matter what. So we're going to look in here in the first quadrant. We're going to say, where is sine? We're looking at all these middle numbers. We're looking where sine is radical 2/2, which is right here. And then we're going to go and we're going to give the radian answer. So you want to look over here to the radian answer. And you're just going to report sine is radical 2/2 at the angle pi/4. So you're just giving the angle answer that has that value. So answer for number 1 is pi/4. For number 2, we're looking for where cosine is -1/2. So again, for cosine, this is where we have to think a little carefully. We can either look in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. Since it's negative, we're going to look in quadrant 2. So you have to know where you're looking right now. So we're going to zoom in here. If I look at quadrant 2, I'm looking for where it is, I forgot right now, -1/2. So cosine is the outside one, so we'd be looking at all these outside values. Here's where it's -1/2, and you'll give that radian answer, 2 pi/3. All right, let's look at the next one. So it's tangent, so we're going to be looking at the last one in the row. We want tangent to be -3. Negative radical 3. So when tangent is negative, we still are going to look in the first quadrant, but we're going to give a negative answer. So we're looking the first quadrant where it would be positive radical 3/3. So we know here, we're looking at those last ones, we know here at pi over 3 would be an answer. So if we want to make it negative, all we would then do is it would technically swing it back here into that other section where it's purple, and that's where it's negative 3 over negative radical 3. But I can't give the answer 5 pi over 3 because that's too big. I have to give it between negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2, so we just want to take the negative version of that place that we found in the first quadrant. So the answer here would be negative pi over 3. Alright, then we're doing sine to be 0. So I'm looking for where sine, that's going to be the middle one, is 0. And right away we're looking in the first quadrant, it's right here. So that's just going to be 0. Oops. And try the next two on your own. Pause the video for a minute. See if you can get the next two. And then I will fill them in. So cosine negative 1. We're looking at the first one for cosine. We're looking anywhere in quadrant 1 all the way to quadrant 2 for cosine. So we're looking anywhere where it's 1. That's the negative 1, the first one. So that's here. So that's going to be pi. And then the next one we're looking for where sine is positive 1/2. So sine is positive 1/2. 1/2 is the middle one. We're looking in the first quadrant. Positive 1/2 is here, so that's going to be pi over 6. Alright, we've got a couple more things to talk about on the next couple pages. These next ones, you're just going to evaluate with your calculator. It does want the answer in radians, so you're going to need to make sure that you put your calculator in radian mode. If you don't remember how to do that, if you go to the home screen, it's the home screen, then number 5, then number 2 for document settings. And it should take you to the place where you can change that. So we're going to evaluate these using the calculator. So you're just going to type in sine negative 1 of 0.67, and we should be expecting an answer between, since it's sine, negative 1.57 and positive 1.57, because that's our range of values we can have. So if you type that in, you should get 0.73. And then for the next one, cosine negative 1 of 2/5, you should get 1.16. Tangent negative 1 of negative 10 is negative 1.47, and cosine negative 1 of negative radical 5 over 3. .41. Alright, then the next type of problems are composed functions. So we need to think about starting from the inside and working our way out. So we're going to start from the inside. We're going to actually be using the plate twice now. So we're going to find where sine negative 1 is 1/2. So where it's positive, so we're looking here, sine is 1/2 at pi over 6. That simplifies the first part of that. We still have the outside part. So then we would want to look, where is sine pi over 6? Well, sine is pi over 6. Sine of pi over 6 is, what is the answer to that? 1/2. So if you notice what happens here, these just cancel each other out because they're inverses of each other. And this is within the domain that it talks about in this blue box here. If you look at that, it had to be within that domain, and it is, so the answer will come out. The problem is sometimes the answers aren't in the domain, so then you won't get an answer. So I would focus mostly on using the plate and seeing how the plate could help you. So looking at number 2, we want cosine of 2 pi over 3. We want to figure out where that is. So that's using the plate forwards. Cosine of 2 pi over 3 is negative 1/2. So then we would look for the inverse. Where is cosine negative 1/2? And I'd look back at my plate. Oh, at that same value. Because when it's cosine, we look in the first and second quadrants. So that's going to be 2 pi over 3 as well. So again, these just canceled each other out. Alright, let's go on to the next page. So number 3 here, we're doing tangent. And we want to know tangent negative 1. Where is tangent 1? So tangent, remember, is that last number. So we want to find where it's positive 1. That's here. So it's going to be at pi over 4. So then we want to take the tangent of pi over 4 and evaluate that. If you notice, that's going to take us right back to where we were. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1. So my answer is 1. Alright, sine. We want to know sine negative 1 of 2 pi. So we're trying to find where sine is 2 pi. If we look at all of our sine values here, those are the middle ones. If I look at all these middle values in the first quadrant, that's the only place we're allowed to look for sine. None of those right now are 2 pi. Actually, it can only go from 0 to 1 or 0 to negative 1. So that's outside of the realm. This is not in the domain, so we can't evaluate this. This is undefined. Alright, and the next one, we want to know what, first we're starting with sine of pi over 6, or 11 pi over 6. So this is the forward way. So 11 pi over 6, the sine of that is negative 1/2. The problem here is they now want us to find sine negative 1 of negative 1/2. Well, it is negative 1/2 in the fourth quadrant, and it's negative 1/2 in the third quadrant, but we're not allowed to give answers from those two quadrants, so we have to go back up to the first quadrant and follow our rules. We want to look for where it's positive. That's right here, so that's going to be positive pi over 6, but since the angle was negative, we're going to make it negative pi over 6. So these ones are an example where this doesn't just cancel out, because this is not in the specified domain. It's not between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So we had to use our plate to work to get the answer. So take a minute and try number 6 on your own and see if you can do similar. So see if you can do that same thing with number 6. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to start it. So cosine of pi over 3 pi over 2 is what we want to figure out first. So I'm looking at 3 pi over 2. The cosine value is 0. But that right now is in the third quadrant, and we're not allowed to look for an answer there when we have cosine negative 1. So we need to look in the first or second quadrant, since it's cosine, where cosine is 0. And that's actually right here. So the answer is going to be pi over 2. So this is again an example where they can't just cancel out, because this is not in that specified domain. It's supposed to be between 0 and pi. It's not. We can still work backwards, though, and figure out where the answer is. Just make sure you're starting with the inside function and working your way out.